I have the pleasure today of introducing Dr. Wei Xiu, who is professor at the Department of Geography here at the University of Lethbridge. He received his BSc and MA in East China Normal University in Shanghai, where he was trained as an urban geographer. He was awarded a PhD in geography at the University of Guelph, and as a China Studies specialist, Dr. Xiu has conducted numerous studies on Chinese urban and regional development. His current research interests include labor market dynamics, the impact of globalization on cities, and relations between development and the environment.
You're both research affiliates of the Prentice Institute.
Yes, we are.
Thank you. That's number one priority. We have to get that right. Thanks, Sharon. Thank you all for coming. It's a great honor to speak to all of you again. Second time to speak here. What I'm going to talk about today is changing inequality in China with a focus, of course, on more recent aspect of inequality, particularly from a labor market point of view. So we know inequality is a global issue. The problem of inequality is quite persistent over time and will not diminish anytime soon, as some hyper-globalists already predicted. It is also becoming a popular issue. Thomas Piketty's book on capital became a bestseller, a New York Times bestseller. It's all about how we come up with these things called inequality, and they're never going to be diminishing. So everyone cares about this issue now because it's becoming a public issue, and it's a worrisome issue because health and inequality will certainly threaten the social stability of any given societies. We tend to hear a lot of inequality issues about China, particularly the increasing wealth associated with the increasing inequality. It's kind of becoming eye-catching. But before I talk about the contemporary inequality issue, what's going on right now in China, I want to give you a bit of historical context so that we can digest the issue a bit better. So I'm going to start my discussion from about the issues before Chairman Mao's communist state established in 1949. Old China before Mao's communist rules was very much a global backward, if any one of you can remember. 90% of the population at the time living in rural areas in China, mostly in the inland, in the north, and in the south. Very primitive, self-subsistence rural economy dominate the scene that you can see here. Majority of the nation wealth was clustered in a few prosperous cities, including the top picture here, Shanghai in the 20s, city of Tianjin in the north, city of Guangzhou in the south. But other than that, you can see from those two left-hand side pictures, both in northern China and southern China in rural economy, very primitive still at that time. Even in those a few prosperous cities, they are very much divided world with a concentration of wealth, often in the colonial concessions, and right at the border regions you will see or you would expect the slums and the squatters surrounding the colonial concessions in Shanghai, in Tianjin, other colonial cities at the time. So who to blame for that kind of inequality at the time? Tremendous. Well, according to Chairman Mao and his colleagues, it was all because the combined suppression of feudalism, the feudal society at a time with a very few large landowners with a lot of poor tenants. And also the colonial occupation of some cities and the imperialism. Plus, of course, the capitalism start to emerge in the city, and on top of all those three so-called mountains, according to the language used by Chairman Mao, there were a tremendous amount of the quite frequent occurrence of all kinds of disasters, flooding, droughts, earthquake, and hurricanes, so constantly harassing the then Chinese society. The hyper inequality and the poverty actually gave the legitimacy of Mao's communist rule and a mass support for a communist revolution, which eventually led to establishment of so-called communist China or New China that we are now familiar with. Are we seeing any decline in inequality under Mao's egalitarian policies? The evidence is certainly mixed. This is a graph showing you a Gini index, which is commonly used to measure inequality of any kind in a society, in a region. As you can see, interprovincial inequality, according to this measure, did not decline at all from the beginning of the communist rule in 1949 until the economic reform happened in 1978. So we can use both or any kind of measures to measure this. But if we look at the spatially, what happened in terms of inequality, and this is a measure of location in quotients about the relative incomes of different provinces against the average. Here you can see at the beginning of the communist rule, the northern part of this country relatively wealthier than the region in the south, and particularly in the southwest, which is a lot poorer. In the coastal area, maybe even at that time, 3 areas, Tianjin, Beijing, so those are the core in the north, and Yangtze River Delta region, particularly Jiangsu area, plus Shanghai and Guangzhou. The patterns start to be altered over time. As you can see, the northern part still dominates in the 60s, but the dominance in northeastern China start to diminish. And by the middle, by the time in the 70s, the picture, kind of a mixed, different kind of inequality is getting bigger. The pattern in space is slightly different. If we look at the rural-urban inequality, as you see from those pictures, certainly we can have a sense about pre-revolution inequality between rural and urban China. Tremendous. And this trend can start to decline according to measure of Gini index again here. So there is a decline, there is an increase across province in terms of inequality. So message is very much mixed. But overall, for rural-urban inequality, sharp decline. The egalitarian ideology and its associated policies clearly prioritize the equity during that time over the productivity and efficiency. the factors that are responsible for inequality at that time during the China's socialism before economic reform and its change certainly were argued to be by scholars related to three major factors, such as state ownership, whether the sectors or the regions dominated by the state ownership, it's better. It performs better in every aspect. And the second factor certainly is related to the state plan priorities. And in the 70s and the 60s and the 70s, we know the priority in China was defense. So instead of putting all the sectors along the coastal area, which is dangerous, very vulnerable to any possible invasions from the West, so they put everything in the middle of the country. Another important aspect responsible for the inequality and the socialism is related to the state hierarchy and the positionalities of different sectors, even individual. Whether you are a party member, your factory is owned by the central state and not by the local state, not owned by the collectives. So your position in the hierarchy is actually responsible for any possible inequality at the time. So very brief sketch about the past. So this actually changing inequality over the past provides us a context within which we can understand and interpret the current inequality that we see. Because if we look at the entire inequality, hyper-inequality as it is indicated in the literature, in the contemporary literature, that China is increasing inequality so big. If we plot the curve using Gini index about the interprovincial inequality, the overall trend is slightly declined. Compared to the Mao Zedong's socialism period. And if we map out the changing inequality in space, what's important to compare the first map here in the 50s and the most recent map here, we certainly find equality is kind of declined, but in a different shape, in different spatial structure completely, because now the regions that are doing well is not the inland north, not at all. Rather, it's all along the coastal area. This is certainly associated with the export orientation in entire Chinese economy. No wonder we are buying things from any big bookstores. They are all from China, because this is the region where everything is produced nowadays. So in the interior, certainly in the western area, their relative share of the nation's wealth declined. If we look at the rural-urban inequality during the post-reform period of time, certainly the pattern is interesting to see. If we compare the rural-urban inequality and the rural-urban inequality using this measure of Gini index or tile index, income ratio, if we wish, they all indicate that current inequality is actually not as bad as what was going on 60 years ago. But this may not be the true story. If we look at the rural-urban inequality, the general trend during the communist socialism under Mao's rule, it was declining substantially. Under the Deng Xiaoping's red capitalism, what is called by George Lin, the rural-urban inequality has increased tremendously. Okay, this is actually the reason why we see nowadays every day in Chinese cities where there were around there are about 210 million migrant workers coming from all over the countries, particularly in the interior, working in the cities. Another problem associated with this interpretation of inequality and its change is Chinese economy is not the same as it was before anymore. Before, everyone was poor, even though a small group of people relatively rich, but majority of the mass was very, very poor, right? Sharing a pair of pants for a family was a common thing before the Communist Revolution. But now, if you look at the Chinese economy over time, it has increased consistently at the very high level. If we look at the GDP per capita in China, it's already all close. This year, 2015, already surpassed $8,000 US dollars per capita. So China is in a middle income bracket, very similar income level, just like, for example, Turkey, if we pick up one of European country there. So that is the broad context for my real story that I want to tell. What I want to do is to give you a bit detailed sense about how inequality in Chinese society, particularly in labor market, is composed of. How can we interpret the reasons responsible for creating the contemporary inequalities that we see, we blame for, we say, oh, we need to somehow alleviate that. So the objective here empirically is to provide an empirical account of labor market inequality in Yangtze River Delta region, which is very big area. I think I have to tell you, account for maybe 10% of U.S. GDP, this region alone. Give you a context. So including 2 provinces, Jiangsu, Zhejiang, and one city, Shanghai. These are all 3 provincial level units in China. So this is the economic powerhouse. And it's been very rich for the last, say, 500 years. Okay, I would say one of the most prosperous region in the world ever since about 14th century, 1400. Okay, so this is what I'm going to do. Give you some of the thinkings that are very popular in the literature about explaining inequalities. What are some of the popular theories there? Of course, neoclassic is a dominant one. Particularly, people in the West tend to favor the human capital theories in explaining why we have inequality in our society, because you have more education, you earn more accordingly, because you accumulated more capital, because you invested more in yourself. So that's basically it. Well, the others says no, this is not the case. Theorists, particularly favoring in segmentation theories, they say, well, there are barriers, not just the reward to the human capital. There are gender discrimination in the society, discrimination against a minority, for example, discrimination against race. So our market is somehow segregated. Apply that kind of to set of theories in China, for example. Rural migrants was argued to be discriminated against. Patriarchal societies in China, and the traditions also favor male. So these theories certainly all can be applied to the Chinese context, but they are not telling the full story. A particularly important thesis is related to globalization and market transition. Because before China was closed, it was not open to the rest of the society. So the globalization was the one to be blamed because of the intrusion of the market mechanism and instauration, and the foreign influence all contribute to the inequalities. The people working in, for example, foreign-owned firms, they are making relatively more compared to those who are working for the indigenous firms. So this is so-called globalization effects on the local labor markets. And particularly Yangtze River Delta region is very much open, because the city of Suzhou in Jiangsu, for example, alone produce 70% of the laptops that you use in the world. And one county in Zhejiang province produces 90% of the socks in the world. So very, very open market, open region here. So these theses certainly can all be used to explain what's going on. But which one is right? Well, if you look at a popular thesis by Victor Ni from Cornell in his well-known, he's a sociologist, very well-known thesis called market transition. He argued that when China started to reform in 1978, what happened is markets start to be dominant factors shaping the inequality, creating a new regime of inequality. Instead of under the communist rule, it is whether you are a political party member, whether you are a casual, whether you are working for state factories, those will be the ones own more, actually earn more in the market. He said, no, these are gone. The market, because of the introduction of the market power, market incentive, market opportunities are the ones that we can actually use to explain what we see in the market. So gender, race, minority, or state ownership, those factors are gone. Well, is it? So I'm going to give you a sense about what I have done. This is an empirical, a bit of technical later on. But I want to show you what I have done. Okay, this is a region, I said, 22% of China's GDP, which is about 10% of US GDP at that time. Okay, so very big region. And Shanghai, this Yangtze River Delta region can be divided into Shanghai, Jiangsu, and Zhejiang, and within which we can divide the city of Shanghai into urban district, rural district, and urban area, rural area. Okay, so we want to know how the inequalities are composed of, so that we can use index to decompose and to really know which part of the inequality is the most important part of the societal inequality here. So we do the same for Jiangsu and Zhejiang, those two provinces. And the data source is from a subset of 2005 1% sample census. So I have 120,000 observations, very large database to play with just for these 3 provincial level units. I use tile index instead of Gini index because it can be decomposed quite easily so that we can know the inequality is between the groups or it's actually happening more within the same group that we are interested in. Then I will try to explain why there is an inequality using a particular method called a quantile regression modeling on inequality determinants. So I want to decompose this overall labor market inequality into several groups. I think they are important to know. The number one is gender. Whether male, female inequality is so big as we all know, or actually it's not. The overall inequality, according to tile index, is 0.348, which is equivalent to the Gini index that we are more familiar with, 0.425, which is very high. So anything beyond 0.5 is that society is in a mess. Okay, that's kind of message you are talking about. So 0.5, so this is very, very close. That's why Xi Jinping, the new president now in China, is combating the poverties and they try to make it a lot a lot more even than ever before. So that's the whole reason, because they see the inequality is getting so big. Okay, 0.4. So I would say South Africa is about 0.6 something. Hong Kong is 0.5 something. Very polarized society. Of course, Hong Kong is. And general China is so big, right? This is a very prosperous region, very big region also. This is a very big number, so keep that in mind. So I want to understand whether it is male-female inequality that's striking or more important in this particular region. What happened is actually the inequality within sex group. So inequality among male workers is the dominant one, or female workers is the dominant one. So because 96% of this inequality happens within the same sex group. So between sex groups, inequality only accounts for 4% of the total. So that's a surprising evidence. Well, if we decompose the inequalities according to within province and between province, so that we can have a sense about spatial variation in equality. So what we find again is the within province inequality. Almost 90% of the inequality happens in each provincial unit. And if we subdivide the province into even smaller administrative regions, which is called prefectures, a level above county. So each prefecture will have about 5 to 10 counties. So what we can find is, well, it is again within group, within each prefecture, inequality dominates the region. We also always argue about the rural-urban inequality. Is it big in this region? Well, if we look at the Yangtze River Delta region and try to decompose the level of inequality according to urban region, rural-urban fringe area, and the rural area, we find inequality within each of the region, each unit, each spatial unit is the dominant ones. It's more significant, actually, greater than those inequalities between different administrative units. And if we look at those who are from the city and versus those who are actually having so-called local residence status. So when they are in the city, they are migrants. So in the labor market, certainly we can differentiate them. Even though they are working in the same city or same province, we want to see whether hukou is actually becoming a critical divider. What we find is actually the majority of the inequality happens for people who have the same hukou status. Okay, so even though it's still significant, 20% is between the groups. People who work or who have a urban residence status certainly is the one making more, okay, than those who have the rural residence status. So I'm going to show you some pretty pictures here. I'm a geographer. I like to use maps to tell my story. Now, first of all, I want to say, this globalization that we talked about early on certainly is important in shaping the income differentials in this region. Okay, as you can see, this is basically the Yangtze River. Yangtze River divided actually the entire region into northern part of Jiangsu and the southern part of Jiangsu and the majority of the Zhejiang area. And as you can see, the rich area, the richest ones are in this. This is city of Shanghai, and this is the nearby so-called very fertile region of Jiangnan. So this entire region is very much actually very richer, relatively much richer than the northerners and the people living in the south. That's the overall pattern of the income distribution in this region. Okay, so in the middle part, more open, more industrialization going on. In the northern part, still some agriculture, and also in the southern part of the study area, dominated by the mountains and the hills, not very favorable environmental conditions anyway. Now let's look at the inequality. Map out the tile index of each region. Well, we don't see a particular pattern. There are some highs, for example, here in the poor region, and also there are some highs in the poor region, and this is the richer region, Wenzhou City. So the message is somehow mixed in terms of whether the income inequality is associated with the level of economic growth or development. Okay, so there is no particular correlation here. And this is a spatial variation of gender income inequality. Again, we look at the spatiality of this distribution in terms of income inequality. We find gender income inequality is a lot higher in the poor region in the north. And in general, in the south, is relatively moderate. That's it, because we still have a kind of exception here in the middle, indicating, in the poorer region, income inequality, gender income inequality can be also high. So there is no universal theories that can be used to explain this kind of pattern. This is the variation of rural-urban income inequality. The pattern is clear, right? So income inequality in both in this area very high, and generally this area more developed regions where rural-urban inequalities getting less and less. So this is a kind of an interesting pattern to see. So if you look at the Hukou status, about people who are from rural, people who are from actually the city. Okay, we also kind of interesting to see in the south, in the core area where Hukou matters much less. So in more developed area, Hukou matters a lot less. In the relatively behind region, so economically not as developed, where you see relatively high inequality among people who have the urban residence versus those who doesn't. So this is about the migration status. And the pattern is kind of mixed. I cannot conclude that much because, this is in general relatively high, and this is high, but there is some regions are relatively low in terms of migration status, who are people who move from region to region. So I say, well, this is kind of odd. This space thing, the geographies of income inequality. The message is very much mixed. By decomposing this, so we certainly know a certain aspect of income inequalities following so-called market transition thesis. Some inequality patterns across space may follow the general new classic theories of inequality. So I actually run a model called a quantile regression. Before I run that, certainly I run an ordinary least square regression to see This model, the benefits is here we only see the average, how the average income, according to the ordinary least square, average income is determined by various kind of income determinants. You don't see how the highest and the lowest are affected by different factors at all. So quantile regression can actually do the job because it reveals the trend of coefficient. As you can see, this is the lower income bracket group of people. This is high income, so from 10%, 20%, and on. So I divide the entire population in the labor market into 10 groups. Okay, and we certainly see that higher earners, high income earners, their starting salary is higher. Okay, and those who are in the low income brackets, their starting salary is lower. But that's basically not the point here. The point is I want to see the variation of rewards in different income earning groups, from high to low. The number one, certainly, we want to see, and I only pick up those coefficients that are significant. Okay, so first of all, we certainly know human capital is significant in shaping labor market inequality. Okay, so but the reward to human capital, to education, varies quite significantly. What you find here, particularly compare 10, 20%, 30% lower income brackets versus 70 and above. What we find here is there is a general trend, particularly for wage premium, for high education wage premium, is significantly higher for high income earners. Okay, so high income earners, their education is worth more, particularly for the high education they receive, college degree, diplomas. Okay, in the low income groups, those are not valued very high. Okay, so you see the rewarding structure varies. If we look at another significant factor is gender or sex here. That means Chinese labor market inequality or inequality in general is not just shaped by the human capital theories or human capitals as explained by new classic theory of labor market. Rather, the gender still plays a significant role in shaping the labor market differential. What we find is the wage premium for male and urban hukou holders is tremendous. Okay, as you can see here, both for this and also for this line. This is male. This is people with urban hukou. Okay, so the advantage of those who have urban hukous, who are male, they tend to get more benefits for those, particularly for those high income earners. So if you are poor, you are male, you are poor to start with, and you did not make that much. What you find here is to be a male, you are not that much different at all. To have urban hukou, you are not that much different at all from those who are not having urban hukou. So those reward is particularly beneficial for high income earners. And of course, there are other significant, even for the control variables, such as this, the occupation or employment type, whether you are employers or you are self-employed. And particularly interesting is the so-called self-employed. This line indicating for those particularly poor to be self-employed is very much beneficial because you tend to have higher award to be in that be that kind of in that kind of profession, and also particularly for the high income owner, particularly rich ones in the society. And for those occupation type, we tend to say occupation type not supposed to be working in shaping the so-called the income inequality. What we find certainly there is a general trend, for all of those occupation types, except for the last two. Of course, this is moderate, generally different. So for high income earners, their reward structure is tremendously different from those low income earners in the labor market. Now, this is the ownership type that I was talking about. In general, it is still significant, but in general, there is not much difference at all, even in terms of rewarding structure. Okay, ups and lows, no particular pattern, ups and lows, except for the unclassified firms, which is not very clear why they are there. Now, I can show you more detailed ones and actually can compare them to each individual labors and their performance. But I think that the evidence is enough basically to show that the income inequality in China is not shaped just by the market-related factors such as human capital, what market transition theory want to argue. It's not all shaped by the so-called state-related factors or societal factors, such as gender, such as ownership type of the firms. There are mixed message here. All these factors are significant in shaping the contemporary inequality. Let me conclude that the determinants of inequality in China changes over time, alongside the societal transformation. Prior to Chairman Mao's rule, under Chairman Mao's rule, after Chairman Mao's rule, and the current economic reform, factors responsible for societal inequality change over time. Okay, depend upon the regimes that we are talking about. The extent that we see today is tremendous, but we saw that before. Certainly, China's integration into global economy has created some spatial variation or gradient of labor market earning differentials. Particularly from the first map, what we see the income differential is very much evident in Yangtze River Delta region. However, high labor market inequality can be still seen. This Thai index of 0.034 is very significant one, very, very high. But there are tremendous variations, so the pattern in space is very much mixed. So in general, I think globalization and economic transition are not the only reason behind the labor market inequality. Gender earnings inequality is associated with the level of economic development and globalization as well. Rural-urban inequality tend to diminish from the core to peripheral in Yangtze River Delta region. And the role of hukou in creating labor market inequality still is quite important. Hukou is a political factor, okay, because it's an institutional mechanism used to shape, to regulate Chinese society in China. At the individual level, earnings inequality is very much shaped by both market and the non-market force. Okay, the theories right now in the literature, somehow they are right, somehow they are all wrong. Rewarding structure varies between high and the low income groups, because by using this quantile regression method, I can actually tease out the exact reward structure for different income bracket people. There is a greater earning opportunities for those who are more educated, with a higher ranked positions or employment. Market tend to reward more to high income earners. So this is a very important discovery through this exercise. Market also discriminate females and people with rural status more in high income stratus. So that's important. So if we are all professors, all making a lot of money, but market tend to discriminate the females, tend to discriminate those who are not from the same city or from a non-city region. Occupation type also reward differently among different income groups. So, what are the meaning of this entire exercise? Well, unlike market transition theory advocated by Victor Ni from Cornell, introduction of market mechanisms in transitional economies does not eliminate the political, institutional, and the social factors in shaping societal or social spatial inequality. Okay, that's an important observation here. When the market mechanisms are put in place, then they tend to reward those who have high human capital, political capital, and social capital. Okay, so market helps those who are already better off a lot more than those who are worse off. The result, of course, implies there is a co-evolutionary process between market factors and the existing social political structure in the process of market transition. So we cannot just say now market plays more important role. Market is dominant in China. It's not the case at all. And actually we can extrapolate this kind of conclusion to include countries like Russia, Central European countries as well. It is this dynamics that structured the current pattern of inequality. So that means we need to call for more research about the causal mechanisms in this co-evolutionary process towards market transition. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop here.